So I'm sorry about the last video. It just stopped recording my voice, so I had to stop it. But what we're going to do in this video is finish the last 3 slides of Lecture 8 here and then jump into Lecture 9. So it will be labeled Lecture 9, but we'll finish these last couple of slides on Roman culture. You watched the video that talked about Roman religion, which I think was really helpful to look at how syncretistic the state religion was in Rome. Syncretism is the idea that you would mix diverse religious ideas and practices, and that was exactly what was going on in the Roman Empire. They would worship Greek and Roman gods, so if you're familiar with Greek and Roman mythology, with Zeus or Jupiter, depending on if you're talking about Greek or Roman, they would have those statues and temples to these gods. They also would sometimes worship the emperor. The end of the video that we didn't watch the whole thing of talked about worshiping Caesar. So they would have emperor worship. And then mystery religions, kind of from the east, had come in and infiltrated the Roman Empire. There's one cult called the Cult of Cybele, or Cybele, and when you were watching that video, it was that whole scene with the killing of the bulls with the blood and the people dancing. It's just very bizarre religious practice. So that's what was going on in the Roman Empire when it came to religious practice at the time of Jesus's life and also Paul's life. But other things were going on, and you read about these in your book. But philosophy was very important in the Roman Empire, and it was linked to religion. So the ideas that we still study today of Platonism and Stoicism and Cynicism were all active, especially among the educated people. And then Gnosticism was a religious philosophy that we're going to talk about a little bit later that may have influenced the writers of the New Testament. Early Christians were influenced by this idea of Gnosticism, but we will talk about that later on. Another couple of things to mention about the Roman Empire: the social classes were very different than what we maybe are used to today in American society. So only 3% of the people in the Roman Empire were actually Roman citizens. It was a very high privilege to be Roman citizen. There were special honors that you had that came along with Roman citizenship, and mostly you were born into it, but often you could buy your citizenship if you were very wealthy. Usually only male landowners would be Roman citizens. Paul actually was a Roman citizen. He was born one, and that helped him several times, saved his life several times, because he was able to get out of jail or whatever. And eventually when he was killed, he was beheaded instead of crucified, because Roman citizens would never be crucified, and so Paul had a different way of dying then because of his citizenship. But there was no middle class in the Roman Empire. There was upper class, very small percentage of upper class landowners and politicians, people in the government, and then everybody else was lower class. The farmers, the artisans, the people who made pottery, merchants, people who had been slaves at one time but were no longer, called libertini. They were called the freed people. And then, of course, a large amount of slaves in the Roman Empire. But slavery in the Roman Empire was different than the slavery that we have had in our modern days, the sort of American slavery, the Atlantic slave trade and things like that. There were a wide variety of kinds of slaves, anywhere from cooks to nurses to midwives, prostitutes, painters, and there were also highly educated slaves, doctors and tutors that worked for families as slaves. So slavery in the Roman Empire was not necessarily based on race or ethnicity like it was in America. In this case, you could be born into slavery if your parents were slaves or one of them was. You could be captured in war and you would become a slave. You could be abandoned child. That happened very often with abandoned girls, baby girls, or you could actually sell yourself into slavery to pay back your debt. So sometimes it was a voluntary servitude idea. So this was a huge building block of the Roman world, and at this point, no one could imagine how the Roman Empire could survive without slaves. This last slide just gives you a little idea of what the Roman fashion styles look like. Slaves, it would be a wide variety of things. You could just pick up, rags from somewhere, like here, this gladiator picture. He's wearing a rag underneath his protective armor. But, if you were a slave of a wealthy person and they wanted everybody to think that they were benevolent, they might give you, better clothes than another slave. But in general, tunics and cloaks and things like that were worn. Romans would sometimes show their legs, though Jews would usually be more covered up in the Roman Empire. Jews would also wear the facial hair, whereas the Romans would not. And with females, it was across the board, but tended to be covered. Women tended to be covered. The ones that had the richer colors of reds and blues and purples were most likely wealthy women, because those dyes were expensive. And then, in Jewish culture, women would cover their heads more often, not necessarily in the Roman culture. So it's just interesting to see the different styles across the board here in the Roman Empire. We're going to go ahead and start into the next lecture. We've finished with a lot of the background, and so now we're going to jump into the chapter that talks about the ministry and the message of Jesus. Just to give you an overview of how this is going to work. So we're going to look at Jesus' life as an amalgamation of all four of the Gospels accounts, and so we're just going to look at it chronologically and look a little bit about his teaching. But then we're going to go back and look at each one of the Gospels separately, because they each have different perspectives and different themes and different things that they want to emphasize. And so we're going to look at the overview first here, and then the next lecture will focus in on the Gospels one at a time. So we've talked about Jesus being born somewhere between 6 and 4 BC during the reign of Herod the Great. A lot of people think that Jesus was born in 0, which there actually is not a year 0. There is a 1 BC or BCE, and then there's a 1 AD or CE, but no 0, and that is not exactly the date that when Jesus was born. But we don't see Jesus on the scene, the social scene, until he begins his 3-year ministry, and that isn't until he's around 30 years old. So that would be anywhere between 26 and 30 AD or CE, if you want to say it that way. We know that Jesus was likely crucified in either AD 30 or 33, because that was when Passover fell on that Friday. But all four Gospels agree that Jesus was crucified in the spring during Passover, and on a Friday afternoon. So you may not be aware of this, but Matthew and Luke are the only Gospels to outline the events around Jesus' birth and early years. So John and Mark just kind of start right in with Jesus' ministry, but we learn about Jesus' early years from Matthew and Luke. And they start telling the story actually before Jesus is born. So Jesus' birth story is surrounded by scandal. Mary and Joseph, who were a betrothed Jewish couple, mysteriously become pregnant, which was a no-no in that culture. If Joseph had asked for it, Mary could have been stoned. But we read in Luke that an angel comes to Mary and tells her not to be afraid, that she's found favor with God, and kind of warns her what's going to happen. And then in Matthew, we read about Joseph getting a visit from an angel as well, and the angel tells him not to be afraid to take Mary home as his wife, that she's pregnant from the Holy Spirit. So angels, scandal, miracles going on here in this birth story. It's very exciting. I love this little video. It's called the Social Network birth of Jesus. So basically, if there were Facebook at the time of Jesus, this is what it would look like. So we're going to look at that real quickly, and then we'll talk about it.
Oh come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel that mourns lonely exile here, until the Son of God appears.
Okay, so that's just a fun way to experience the birth of Jesus as told by Matthew and Luke. Let's see, we have a little bit more time to look at Jesus' childhood. What's so interesting about the gospel accounts is that we don't actually know much about Jesus' childhood and teenage years. We don't pick back up with the story until Jesus is 30 and starts his public ministry. But we do know a couple of stories. From Luke, we know that Jesus was taken to the temple in Jerusalem to be dedicated when he was 8 days old, which is the Jewish custom, and he would have been circumcised as well. We know from Matthew that the family had to end up fleeing to Egypt because King Herod had found out that there was a baby born that people were saying was the king of the Jews. The Magi said that. And so he started killing baby boys, Jewish baby boys under the age of 2. So they left in order to get away from this persecution, and they settled in Egypt and then returned when Herod the Great died in 4 AD or 4 CE. And then we don't know much about his childhood after that, except for in Luke, Jesus shows up in the temple with his parents, and he's there for a festival, and he ends up listening to the teachers of the law and asking questions. This is when his parents accidentally left him there. It's probably because there were large groups of people traveling, family and friends and stuff, so they were not neglecting Jesus. But the last thing that Luke tells us about Jesus at this time period is that he was obedient to his parents, and he increased in wisdom and in favor with God and people. So that's sort of the overview of Jesus' childhood. And then we'll pick back up in the next lecture video talking about Jesus' ministry and his teaching.